May 18th, 2023, and this is another edition of our Fraternity Roundtable, which is an effort to bring important speakers to the attention of the Greek community. My name is Robert Platt, and I'm here to host and introduce tonight's topic. Tonight's topic is fraternities and the decarbonization and the Ithaca Green New Deal. And basically, we're here to discuss how Greek life, our essential residential experience, can adapt to the worldwide effort on climate change. This includes decarbonization, which means moving from using natural gas to all electric buildings. There are also other important initiatives such as improving energy efficiency through insulation or the swap out of appliances. This controversy is of long standing, and Cornellians have been on every side of the natural gas climate debate issue. For example, Alan Miller, 71, a Pi Lambda Phi alumnus, spent his life sounding the alarm for climate change. George Slocum, 62, served as CEO of the Transcontinental Gas Pipeline Company. Sue Dean Gibbons Kelly, class of 73, law 76, served as a Federal Energy Regulatory Commission commissioner. Society has made a large investment in existing infrastructure. There are thousands of miles of natural gas lines that connect New York State to supplies in Alberta, Canada, the Gulf of Mexico, Texas, and Oklahoma. That infrastructure has already been largely amortized. In addition, individual buildings have installed gas heating, hot water heaters, ovens, and clothes dryers. The federal government has taken an all-of-the-above approach toward energy policy, providing tax incentives instead of mandates to advance climate change goals. At least one Ninth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals decision has held that the City of Berkeley, California's local ordinance banning gas hookups was preempted by federal law. And if this spreads, perhaps more of the statutes we're talking about might be impacted. Time will tell. At the federal level, there is a lot of latitude and there's a lot of emphasis on financial incentives, tax credits, and so on. However, New York State, in the budget that was just adopted, included restrictions on new gas hookups effective in 2026. The City of Ithaca has its own ordinance, which one of our guests will describe. Further, there's the prospect of Cornell adopting its own internal mandates that would be, quote, unfunded mandates applicable to at least Cornell-owned buildings in terms of their energy usage. All of this is very complex, and companies such as BlocPower may be useful in taking maximum advantage of tax credits and other incentives, as well as providing financing. Tonight, our guests are Rebecca Evans, who's the Acting Director of Sustainability for the City of Ithaca, the first city in the U.S. to commit to community-wide carbon neutrality. Rebecca is a Virginia native and moved to Ithaca in 2017. Ethan Bondaruk is the Ithaca Program Manager for BlocPower, leading implementation of the City of Ithaca Green New Deal goals to electrify its entire stock of 6,000 buildings. Ethan is a licensed professional engineer in New York, having previously worked as an engineer and project manager in private and municipal settings in the water and wastewater sectors. He lives in Lansing, New York, and enjoys Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, triathlon, and the outdoors. Joining him is Russ Lindell, who works on BlocPower's enterprise partnership team, helping large-scale building stock owners like municipalities and utilities design and implement broad electrification programs. He lives in Brooklyn, New York, and is a Lambda Chi Alpha alumnus. So I will return the floor over to Rebecca. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you, and thanks for the introduction. I know it's probably going to be hard to pick me out in this crowd. I look so much like everyone else on this call. So I apologize in advance to Ethan. He's already seen a variation of this presentation already today. We were up at Cornell this afternoon in the Atkinson Center, so my apologies, Ethan. But I'm just going to go through sort of a pretty typical presentation that I would give to someone like council or the Planning and Economic Development Committee. And I'm going to speed through some of this, and then I'm going to linger on some other ones. But please feel free, if you've got questions, go ahead and ask while we're in the throes of it. I don't feel the need to wait until the end. But if you feel strongly otherwise, I'm happy to do it another way too. So as Bob mentioned, I'm Rebecca Evans. I'm the acting director of sustainability. I've been with the city for about 2 years now. Before that, I worked in the sustainability office at Ithaca College. Before that, I was working in the Richmond, Virginia metropolitan area doing a countywide climate action plan. And before that is a very, very tangled story of how I ended up here. So we'll save that for another time and maybe a couple of cocktails. But just as a quick sort of overview, this is the language that was used within the Green New Deal resolution that was adopted by City of Ithaca Common Council in 2019. So really generally community-wide carbon neutrality by 2030. So that includes commercial buildings, that includes residential homes, that also includes government. And there's some interim goals to that overarching goal as well, including 100% renewable electricity in government operations by 2025, 50% reduction in fleet emissions, so government fleet emissions by 2025 as well. Definitely facilitating a comprehensive public engagement process, which is part of, one of the reasons that I'm here today. This is very much falls into that. And the lens through which we do all of this work is just to ensure that all of the benefits of the Green New Deal are shared equally among all of our communities in order to try and repair or otherwise reduce some of the historic social and economic inequities that have been present here as they have been all around the country. So I'm going to run through just a few of the successes or highlights that we've had over the past 2 years. At the very, very beginning, we defined what the Green New Deal was. So you saw those couple of bullet points that were included in the resolution. Not a whole lot of teeth to it, not a whole lot of information on how we're actually going to get there. So we ended up trying to refine that a little bit more, and we're able to break down the Green New Deal into 10 distinct program categories. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a little bit. We also signed the Finger Lakes Energy Compact with the United Nations, which was a partnership between the town of Ithaca, Ithaca College, the City of Ithaca, and Cornell University that establishes various renewable energy investment targets. They're different for each entity, but at the end of the day, we're all trying to get to the same goal of zero. We also adopted the Ithaca Energy Code Supplement in 2021, which requires net zero construction by 2026. And again, I'll go through some more of the details of what that really means in a bit. We also did an electrification study, and this is an ongoing project. So what are the implications of all electric buildings and all electric vehicles on the grid? As it stands right now, our current grid infrastructure really does not have, the capacity to actually support all of the electricity that we expect to be pulled from the grid at any given time. We can actually, it's more like a third that we can expect the grid to support. So we're continuing to narrow in on, what those load profiles ultimately look like, particularly around peak times, and expect to finish up that analysis sometime probably early 2024. We also released an RFP in 2021 that was seeking essentially a coalition of partners to address building emissions in the city. It has a very attractive name, energy efficiency retrofit and thermal load electrification. We decided that was a bit of a mouthful though, and have shortened it to Electrify Ithaca. Which, really was seeking to, rip out all of the fossil fuel equipment in existing buildings and create financing structures that made it so it wasn't too much of a burden on property owners. We also established the Green Jobs Corridor, which is a partnership between a number of municipalities in this region, including Syracuse, Rochester, Elmira, Binghamton, and looking to expand that a little bit more. How can we get particularly vulnerable populations into this new economy with green jobs, and how can we provide the wraparound services so that there aren't as many typical hurdles that we would ordinarily see? So we can provide the training, we can provide childcare, we can provide transportation. This stemmed from a $30 million grant from the EDA that we were unsuccessful in securing, although now with the IRA and NYSERDA, the state trying to reallocate some money in a few new programs that I'll talk about in a little bit. Increasing funding to programs like that, we expect this to be a lot more successful moving forward. We also completed our first greenhouse gas inventory, and just for a little bit of context, buildings in the city of Ithaca, depending on the accounting methodology that you use, represent about 60% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the city. Transportation is just under another 40%, and then everything else is right around 2%, give or take. I think it's 1.7%, so that includes waste, that includes process energy, that sort of thing. And then finally, in July 2022, we launched the Electrify Ithaca program, which was a partnership with BlocPower. That was a result of that RFP process, and I will leave all of that talk to our BlocPower friends on the call in a little bit. We've also completed a stock analysis that took an asset inventory of all mechanical equipment in municipal buildings, and also did some modeling for geothermal on those buildings. That was actually a Master of Engineering project with Cornell. And this one ultimately we'll talk about in a little bit as well. We passed a CCA, or Community Choice Aggregation enabling law, local law, which really just says that government is giving staff the okay to go ahead and explore an implementation plan, data protection plan, and community outreach plan that would allow the municipality to purchase energy on behalf of residents, depending on how they're categorized with the utility. So ultimately, Cornell University does not automatically get enrolled into a program like this, although based on conversations with Bob, it sounds like maybe some of y'all's buildings would fall into the opt-out category, which means you would automatically be enrolled, assuming that you're not purchasing electricity from an ESCO, and I'll go into that a little bit more. We also define climate justice communities. So I mentioned that we're doing all of this through a lens of justice, and sort of one of the main pillars of the Green New Deal is what we're calling Justice 50, which is a riff on the federal Justice 40 policy, which says that 40% of all clean energy benefits and investments need to go to disadvantaged communities. And when we actually tried to apply the federal and the state guidance for disadvantaged communities to the city and the town, we found that there were just a ton of community members that were falling through the cracks that ultimately should be receiving these benefits. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that so many properties are rental properties in Ithaca, just around 76%. So we don't fall into the really strict sort of grid and neighborhood sort of fallout that like New York City or LA might. So we have a lot of geographically dispersed populations. And then finally, we entered into phase 2 of the Ithaca Energy Code supplement, which just doubles the number of points that are required for new construction or deep renovations. And then we're dragging a few projects into 2023 and beyond. Certainly, I mentioned CCA, so bulk energy procurement that includes natural gas and electricity, ultimately trying to secure a more competitive price on 100% renewables. We're also looking at a zero emissions transportation plan and a subsequent RFP. So instead of the municipality, say, carving out capital project budget to purchase, 1, 2, 3 electric vehicles here and there, can we actually lease our entire fleet and get to, say, 60% electric vehicles in 1 year? Also working on putting pen to paper on the climate action plan. All of the elements that I've mentioned so far, that is all part of the climate action plan, but it only lives in one place, which is in my brain. So now trying to actually go through the motions of putting that on paper and getting it approved by council. I mentioned Justice 50 as well. Again, this is the lens through which we do all of our work, which is modeled after Justice 40, but again, upping the ante a little bit, saying that at least 50% of the benefits of the Green New Deal need to go to climate justice communities. And after a lot of conversations, have realized that the way that we're framing benefits is a little bit nebulous, and it's really, really difficult to track. So instead, we're looking at direct financial investment actually going to disadvantaged communities. Electrification again, and then really close monitoring of the Inflation Reduction Act and the CLCPA scoping plan to see, as money becomes available, how can we as government take advantage of that, but also how can residents in the city take advantage of that funding as well. And, I usually preface this slide, and I guess I don't know if it's even true anymore, that this is something that I usually would share with council, sort of the externalities to the Green New Deal. But now I think it's something that everybody should really know. One of the things that we hear more often than not is, why aren't you moving fast enough? And that's second only to what day is recycling day. So, there are a lot of things that impact just how quickly we can implement programs under the umbrella of the Green New Deal that are really outside of government control. So, I mentioned the state of the grid. That's a really big one. That is going to really determine how, where, and when we can electrify buildings and electrify vehicles, and ultimately provide the infrastructure that's required for those vehicles. So we really do need to partner with NYSEG and with our CCA administrator to really strategically deploy distributed energy resources like solar, like battery storage, so that we can help support the grid and rely less on the utility. We're also seeing a lot of new state regulations. There are some that I'll talk about in a little bit about specific buildings, but there are also new regulations that dictate how existing programs that have been traditionally sort of rubber stamped at the state level now have a lot more regulations and hoops that we need to jump through. So a lot of that is pushing our timeline back, just trying to comply with those new regulations. And then, of course, everyone's favorite, we have some market pricing difficulties in supply chains. This is not unique to Ithaca. This is not even unique to New York. So, how can we work with energy supply companies, product vendors, and our CCA administrator and BlocPower to negotiate better pricing and try and take advantage of economies of scale? And then what I think is the biggest challenge is this wider sort of culture adoption and sort of this collective co-ownership of the Green New Deal. A lot of people are seeing this as a government-driven project, and in technicality it is, but at the end of the day, it's all of us that need to get on board to do this. Government is ultimately not going to come out and say every building needs to be electric by tomorrow. That's just not feasible, and it puts a burden on homeowners that is just not fair. So we need to try and create space for people to see themselves in this transition and create new opportunities within the transition itself. With the change in order, we are seeing some renewed support or new support in some cases. President Joe Biden has signed the bipartisan infrastructure law, which is creating a whole new cash flow for electrification in particular. And Governor Hochul is no different, so also seeing support from the state. And just so you have a little bit of idea of how much money we're actually talking about, specifically for energy and climate, we're talking about $385 billion across the United States, and that's broken down in different ways, and different government entities at the end of the day are responsible for implementing or distributing those funds. A lot of it is going to ultimately come down through NYSERDA in New York State, which is sort of quasi-government. So the good news is that our contact points don't really change. It just means that our process might change. And this is a busy slide, but I just include it just to show, these are the different buckets of activities that the Climate Action Council scoping plan covered, which is the sort of implementation arm of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the state's climate action plan. And they're thinking about it a lot, almost exactly the same way that the city is. So we're all moving in the same direction. We're all trying to do the same things. So how can we sort of leverage collective resources to actually achieve our collective goals? Excuse me. Okay, so I think this is what people really wanted to talk about. So CLCPA, the recently passed New York State budget and local buildings, what does that really mean? Included in the New York State budget, but not by name, is the newly minted or soon to be minted Cap and Invest program, which is an economy-wide emissions cap. So we're going to see this play out in a number of ways. We don't know exactly how yet. We don't know all of the details, but we will by the end of 2024, I suspect. And the way that breaks down is that 30% of the money that's actually coming from the investment portion is going to be reserved for consumer rebates. Another 3% is going to industrial small business that is going to be impacted by this transition. So, smaller energy supply companies is what immediately comes to mind. And then the rest of that 57% needs to be diverted to disadvantaged communities per the CLCPA. We also saw a new electric buildings mandate that requires that new buildings up to 7 stories be all electric by 2026 and 8+ story buildings all electric by 2029. Similarly, the City of Ithaca and the Town of Ithaca have their own energy codes, which are supplements to the state code. It's based on a points-based system, so if you're familiar with LEED, L-E-E-D, for buildings, it's similar in structure to that, where you need to achieve a minimum threshold of points in order to get your building permit. So again, this is new construction or deep renovations, and the points actually just doubled on January 1st of 2023. And ultimately will get us to net zero by 2026. But that does not include the way that it's currently written, process energy or energy that's used for cooking. However, I anticipate making changes or amendments to that energy code that would remove that cooking qualifier, that we will actually require electric in cooking as well. This was originally written, I think it was started in 2018, 2019. And if you're a reader of the Washington Post, you know that there's a lot of hubbub around right now with natural gas stoves, and we would like to follow suit. And then finally, New York State is ultimately going to be requiring building performance disclosures. So in 2024, they're going to require benchmarking for commercial buildings that are 10,000 square feet or larger. In 2025, upon the sale or lease of any unit, a property owner is going to be required to provide prior year energy consumption data to the lessee or to the buyer of the property. That actually is applied to single family, multifamily, and commercial. And then in 2027, the state's ultimately going to require a performance rating at sale of a property, and that's just for single family. And then just to highlight some of the things that are sort of in the works for 2023, we do have a green hydrogen and EV charging project at the Southworks campus, formerly the Emerson Power Plant or Chainworks. And that's using solar arrays to power electrolyzers that ultimately will fuel TCAT's electric buses up on the Southworks campus. We're also looking at internal carbon pricing. So this would just be for government to help us in decision-making processes to better appreciate sort of the full life cycle and impact of carbon. And as a disclaimer, all of the things in bold here are things that we're doing in collaboration with Cornell through various departments. So creating an urban digital twin for the city, how can we actually model different scenarios? If we were to make X investment versus Y investment, how would that play out over 10 years, 20 years? And ultimately, how can we better strategize the deployment of DERs to support our grid? As I mentioned, that is going to be a really big issue. We've also done an assessment of the cost of inaction in the city, and the numbers needed some refining. This was done as an MPA, final MPA project at Cornell, that ultimately, we're assuming that the Green New Deal in total is going to cost about $2 billion. That's billion with a B. But the cost of not doing anything is closer to around $2.8 billion. So at the end of the day, we are saving money long term. We've signed a contract to do energy assessments for the city's building stock and create a subsequent energy roadmap. So how do we decarbonize our own facilities? Looking at large-scale solar array and battery storage, LEED for city certification, which again is a lot like LEED for buildings, but looking at the entire city and not just physical infrastructure. We're also looking at a deconstruction ordinance. So if a developer is going to be knocking down a building, there would be requirements for reuse and recycling of the building materials, and then a related comprehensive waste strategy. I'm also working with the engineering department to look at building energy performance standards. This would likely only apply to commercial buildings over a certain threshold of square feet. But how do we make sure that buildings are meeting a minimum threshold of energy efficiency for existing buildings, and then benchmarking and required disclosure of that benchmarking. And we're also doing some modeling with a PhD student based on our net zero goals and current workforce capacity, market conditions, and supply chain. Realistically, how many more people do we need to add to the workforce to get to zero by 2030? And if we were to continue with our existing workforce and not add any more capacity, how long would it realistically take us to get to zero? So I know I ran through that really, really fast. I talk really, really fast. But I'm happy to answer any questions. How do I stop sharing here? There we go.
Why don't we hold the questions until the end if we can? I
Sure.
do want to point out that Robert Horwath, who's a professor of environmental science at Cornell, did serve on the New York State Climate Action Commission and was very instrumental in some of these provisions. It's now time to turn it over to Ethan and BlocPower, and then at the
Yeah, I
conclusion
sat
of
next to Bob Hoare today at a Cornell event that Rebecca was presenting at. It was interesting.
yes, he's a great guy, and he's the past chair of the University Assembly. Okay, the floor is yours, Ethan.
Thank you very much. Let me just make this work all magic-like. All right, yeah, hey, thanks for having us, Bob and everyone. Yeah, I'm Ethan Bodnarick with BlocPower here with my colleague Russ Lindell. So we'll just be going over BlocPower, how we work, and Bob mentioned that, you know, this is like a kind of 10,000 foot view. Want to make sure that everyone's on the same page with decarbonization generally, the tools of the trade, etc. So there's me, Ithaca Program Manager. Russ is our enterprise partnership, one of our folks doing that. So we'll just briefly touch on BlocPower's role in the Ithaca Green New Deal. I'll cover some key facts about decarbonization, climate change, and electrification. Russ will go over the benefits of electrification in buildings, the BlocPower process and financing that we offer, and then I'll kind of touch on more specific incentives that the fraternity houses could take advantage of, BlocPower's role in kind of making that simpler, and just some aggregate data from our Block Maps program that can kind of map and present some of that kind of information. So as Rebecca mentioned, BlocPower is the program manager for the Electrify Ithaca program. The goal that the city passed officially in legislation is to decarbonize all 6,000 buildings in the city by 2030. Certainly other contractors are doing that work, but BlocPower's as well, but BlocPower's role is to really be the organizing force, the manager behind that. And so we're building our relationships with all the contractors in this area and really pushing forward this work. You know, we have very close relationships with the utilities, local one, NYSEG, other ones across the state, of course, the NYSERDA programs, and we're looking forward to how the Inflation Reduction Act will help cut costs for Ithaca projects as well. And BlocPower has a really community organizing based approach, starting from our CEO, Donnell Baird, and you know, having this community rootedness just helps us get projects going in all parts of any community, and Ithaca in particular, raising awareness and making sure that our projects and the benefits are going into underserved communities. So, you know, what is decarbonization? Why is it important? So, you know, the challenge is we need to power our modern lifestyles without the use of fossil fuels or releasing greenhouse gases from fossil fuels, at least. So decarbonization is getting the fossil fuels, which are carbon based, out of our energy systems, so we're not releasing those greenhouse gases into the environment, which trap heat and warm our environment. So, you know, one major aspect of decarbonization industry, economy-wide, is building electrification and transportation electrification. So BlocPower is especially focused on building electrification, but we overlap a little bit with transportation as well. And so in addition to just having more and more of our power-based applications coming from electricity, we also need energy efficiency, doing more with less energy, and then we need a greener power grid. If we got to make sure our electricity is getting greener if we're using more and more electricity. A challenge of decarbonization is the workforce required to do all this transitioning. BlocPower is very involved with that. And then, we have an eye on climate justice as well, along with the city. So this is just a quick graph of greenhouse gas emissions for the United States. It always blows my mind, a metric ton of a gas. Like how does a gas ever weigh a whole metric ton? But regardless, we're emitting over 6,000 million metric tons a year. So it's a real challenge for this graph to start coming down rapidly, and building electrification will help with that. Just one quick view of climate justice. There's many different perspectives. One kind of globally, I just want to point out is that this graph shows that in general across the world, countries that use more energy have higher gross domestic products, have more advanced economies, more wealth. And so part of this challenge is for richer countries, we've been inefficient in use of our electricity, so we can decrease that sum of our energy and decrease that sum. And then also with a lot of the electrification technologies out there, they are much more efficient to begin with. So weatherization and electrification go together. But for a lot of the poorer countries out there, we have to keep in mind that they need a lot more energy in order to be prosperous. And so the focus has to also be on how do we produce more energy and more technology that uses that energy well. So I'll just cover the main tools of the trade that BlocPower focuses on in this building electrification agenda goal process here. So our bread and butter are heat pumps. So heat pumps are electrical technologies, and they move heat instead of burning a fuel. So they can work in both heating mode and air conditioning mode. They have a refrigerant. They use fancy thermodynamics, condensing and evaporating the refrigerant to either do heating or cooling. So what's really neat about them is they're super efficient. So you might use one unit of energy to move 3 units of energy. So you're getting a 300% efficiency, whereas fossil fuels, your gas furnaces, boilers, even the high efficiency ones are like 95% efficient. Another advantage with heat pumps are there's better air quality, there's advanced filtering that's going on, and then there's more temperature control because the units are usually more spread out within a building, and so you can have more zones and specific control. And as Rebecca mentioned, as BlocPower is expanding nationally, we're pursuing national scale economies of scale for purchasing of heat pump technologies. So weatherization is another key tool of the trade. Our current workforce development programs focus on that. We've had some in Ithaca lately. I've been really moved by folks I've met personally who are from areas of the Bronx, say with a lot of gun violence, and they were able to get into these workforce development programs to have opportunities in the green energy economy. But in general weatherization, the focus is decreasing air leakage and heat loss from our buildings. There's a lot of places air can leak into and out of a house. Ithaca has a lot of older buildings. In particular, they're especially poorly insulated. So weatherization involves sealing cracks around windows and doors, insulating basements, attics, walls, and using more efficient windows or window inserts when it's not feasible to replace windows. Solar voltaics also are a major tool of the trade. They can be, implemented at the rooftop scale or large field scale. We're able to finance and support these sorts of projects also and connect folks to contractors to install them. As we all know, photovoltaics convert sunlight to electricity. They are a major component of a green electrical grid, and the renewable energy credits associated with them can lower your electric bills. And so it's a nice way to save some energy and make it for the grid as well. A lot of students at Cornell these days have electric vehicles. So electrification of the whole transportation sector requires a charging infrastructure. We think how many gas stations are out there. Well, people need places to charge their electric vehicles and to do it quickly. Chargers can be installed at private or public locations, of course. And then there are excellent subsidies in the Ithaca area for installation of EV chargers. And then another aspect is not just what the grid can handle, but what can your electrical panel, electrical service, wires at your home or business handle. So of course, as we're electrifying buildings and transportation, that leads to increased electricity use. So the utility itself may need to install upgrades from the pole to a house or a business, and then buildings themselves will need electrical panel upgrades to handle those increased loads. So that ends my portion for now, and I'll turn it over to Russ to cover more about BlocPower's specific role here.
Yeah, thanks, Ethan, and thank you all again for being here. Appreciate you taking the time and listening to us. So, we've talked a lot this evening about BlocPower's role in, addressing the climate crisis more broadly. We want to decarbonize buildings for really three reasons. The big ones that people talk about a lot are reducing your greenhouse gas emissions, addressing climate change. Number two is a financial consideration. One, buildings that electrify have a higher property value than those with fossil fuel infrastructure. And more often than not, when you electrify, your overall utility spend is going to go down. But the third consideration that doesn't really get talked about as much is health focused. So there have been a lot of studies done recently and a lot of bodies of evidence linking the deleterious health effects of fossil fuel burning equipment like boilers and gas stoves to increased risks of asthma and that sort of thing. Ethan, you can jump forward, please. So what we're trying to address, as Ethan mentioned earlier, is the poor air quality inside, because as a whole, buildings are inefficient and unhealthy in the U.S. I don't know what fraternity houses look like today, but when I was living in the Lambda Chi house 20 years ago, not the healthiest place on campus. So I would imagine, air quality is definitely a low-hanging fruit area where you can improve things. The carpets might still smell like beer, but you can at least make the air you're breathing inside a little bit cleaner. Get rid of some of those volatile organic compounds, benzene, methane, all the stuff that fossil fuel equipment leaks, that's linked to asthma, to cancer, and all that sort of fun stuff. All right, next slide. So how does BlocPower help? Well, we're a clean tech company, and what we do is install, manage, and finance building electrification projects. So this is decarbonization, sort of where it's most needed and where it's often least talked about. When I got involved in the clean energy world, before I knew much, I thought it was just all solar panels and wind turbines. But really, the most important part of addressing the country's greenhouse gas emissions comes from stuff like this, comes from fossil fuel infrastructure in the buildings where we live. So that's where we're trying to make the biggest impact. Next slide. So that's why we rely on heat pumps. And if you're not familiar with heat pumps, you see one there. I also, like in my apartment in Brooklyn, you see I've got one right up there. So I have them, I like them. They work great, they heat and they cool. And these are the projects that we're installing in projects across the country. Next slide. But the thing is, electrifying buildings is a complicated process. Next slide. It requires finding contractors, sometimes multiple contractors. You might need an HVAC installer, an electrician, a plumber. You have to file for permits. Sometimes you have to find financing. Sometimes you have to actually source the equipment. There are a lot of moving parts that make doing an electrification project in your building a daunting task. So that's where BlocPower comes in. Next slide. Our goal is basically to be the project manager, or GC, as well as the financier of an electrification project. So we bring all these different moving parts under one roof. So you have one point of contact, that's BlocPower, and we handle everything else. Next slide. So one of the important ways that we do this is by financing the vast majority of the projects that we complete. Most people, whether you're a single family homeowner or you're a trust that owns a fraternity house, you don't have tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars laying around in CapEx to throw at a project like this. So that's why most of our projects are executed under our 15-year capital lease. We've structured this to be accessible for as many people as possible. There's no money down, and we also don't put a lien on the property itself. So our agreements are secured by the equipment itself. It is a capital lease, so it's a buyout at the end of the term. And during that 15 years, BlocPower covers the operations and maintenance of the system. So it's a way to make electrification not only easy, but affordable. We want to, sign a contract with you, but we're not going to then shake your hand and walk away. We're with you for that whole 15 years, making sure the equipment's working the way it's supposed to, and making sure that you're happy with the purchase. There are other particularities to how we finance projects. Actually, Ethan, if you go to the next slide. Like I said, we do this because we've got generous backing from some of our investors like Goldman Sachs and Microsoft, where a lot of our project financing dollars come from. And they're designed in a way to be, fairly low interest rate and accessible to a lot of people. That was the founding ethos of our CEO, Danelle Baird. He grew up in public housing in Brooklyn and wanted to make these kind of electrifications projects accessible to, those like his family and his neighbors where he grew up. So our structure is a little bit different than an ESCO or a PACE, and we found it's actually a lot more successful and accessible. So, when I was a Lambda Chi, I was the rush chairman. I guess I'm kind of trying to rush all of you now and convince you that electrification is a really cool, easy thing, and we're a good partner for it. So, I don't want to get into too many details on each building, each fraternity house, because everyone is different. But if you're interested, I'd love to set up follow-up conversations with anyone individually where we could get into the details a little bit more and see what electrification would look like in those buildings. And I will now pass it back to Ethan.
Sure. Just this opportunity to talk to the Interfraternal Council really sparked up a lot of memories and fun email chains within the BlocPower family. It was pretty fun. And my college actually didn't. It was so small they didn't have fraternities, so I feel like I missed out on that experience. We're glad Russ had been part of it. So just on the incentive side, as he mentioned. There are just a lot of barriers, a lot of confusion, a lot of steps involved in electrification and just any construction project in general. If you're not comfortable handling all those aspects, BlocPower is definitely here to do that all. That's a major service we provide. And it's no different for incentives themselves. The incentives that are out there, there's so many different groups, even within just our own utility, NYSEG, each a separate engineering firm or consultant managing different programs. It's really a headache, all the different programs that are out there and the coordination that happens. So, let BlocPower, let us have all the fun and handle that for you. The Inflation Reduction Act is a major program that was passed and became active this year. It involves both upfront rebates for heat pumps, for weatherization, for electric appliances, which will be available more towards the end of the year, and also tax credits that offset the cost of these. And, interestingly, thinking about fraternities that are nonprofits and Cornell, that's a nonprofit, these tax credits can be syndicated or transferred to BlocPower and then passed on to our customers, to the fraternity houses. So that's a real benefit from those. A lot of folks think that because they're a nonprofit, tax credits don't help them, but that's not the case. Another major incentive program in this area in Ithaca is the multifamily energy efficiency program. It's specifically calls out that fraternities are eligible, a main focus of it. And right now they have an enhanced incentive for insulation and weatherization that can cover up to 90% of those costs through October 1st. Some of the basic air sealing doesn't cost a whole lot, but when you really get to doing insulation in walls and attics and basements, there's a lot of labor involved in that. So this is a huge incentive that's out there. EV charger incentives, as I mentioned earlier here, they are big in Ithaca. They can cover up to 50% of the costs if it's private use only, and 100% if the public has access to charging. And then, other incentives that are out there are federal and state solar photovoltaic subsidies. So whether you put them on your own roof or invest in them otherwise in other locations, there's subsidies for that. So last, I just wanted to show an example of what our Ithaca Block Maps software program can do. We went ahead and entered all 31 building addresses of the fraternities in the Interfraternal Council. And our Block Maps program, takes a high-level estimate at what it would take to electrify buildings cost-wise, what the greenhouse gas impacts would be, and kind of breaks it down on some of the different technologies. So these numbers are all, before incentives, so the numbers go down a lot with that. But, a super kind of rough, high-level estimate for costs for upgrading all of these buildings would be around $11 million, which would be reduced significantly with incentives. But interestingly, the greenhouse gas impact would be about 1% of the entire city. So 1% doesn't sound a lot, but when it's, one group of folks could knock down that much for the entire city of Ithaca, that's pretty significant overall, really. So just wanted to kind of share that with you all, and that ends our presentation. So to get in touch, here's Russ's email, russ@blockpower.io, and mine as well, and we would love to follow up with any of your houses, your organizations that are interested in starting this process and seeing what it would take to electrify and what benefits that can bring.
Right. We have set aside a considerable amount of time for Q&A, which we'll start now. And as the host, I'll start by asking the first question, which is, there are various sources of funding, and I think people really need a lot of advice on that. So non-Cornell owned houses can always get mortgages or financing from the local bank or the credit union or something. There's also the federal tax incentives, which, because most of our houses are owned by nonprofits, we really need a certain amount of brokering to turn those tax credits over to somebody who can write them off on their tax return in exchange for money funding the improvements that generate them. And then there's also the other questions of Cornell's internal funding, which used to be very reliable up until about 10 years ago, and then Cornell sort of cut that off. So based on your preliminary discussion so far, what do you see as funding? I mean, like, what can we put on a BlocPower lease? What can we get tax credits from the federal government on, and so on?
Yeah, so there are, in terms of what we can finance, it's really a little bit of everything. We have financed air source heat pump projects, ground source heat pump projects, insulation, window replacements, solar installations, like anything, electrical upgrades, panel upgrades, anything that falls under the broad umbrella of, building efficiency, we can finance. Where that money is coming from, there is a big question mark here, which is around the Inflation Reduction Act. We know there's going to be a lot of money coming for projects like this, as Rebecca mentioned earlier. Some of that we are still waiting on guidance from the Department of Energy to see exactly how and where it's going to flow, through existing state energy offices or to utilities or directly to property owners in the form of a rebate or tax credit. So there's money coming down. We don't know yet what form it's all going to take.
Yeah, and just adding to that, we do know that the tax credits, like I mentioned before, will be transferable and applicable through that means to nonprofits. So that's very important. And then BlocPower, we have strong and relationships with the local utilities, regular coordination meetings with them, and it's something we hear a lot, that there's incentive programs out there, there's multiple ones, and they just aren't getting used as much as the utilities want. They have charges built into our electric and gas bills to raise money for these incentives, and they're required to spend that money. But if folks aren't applying to them, then those funds don't get spent. So it's really part of BlocPower's process of not just making this more accessible to everyone, but just making it simpler, that we pull together all these different incentives to put together the best package.
Right. I'll ask Rebecca a question, then I'll call on Rocco next. You can raise your hands if you do have questions. The questions for Rebecca is the CCA, the aggregation. So what opportunities are there for fraternity houses, both Cornell owned and independently owned, to aggregate things like remote solar farms or purchases of green energy, that sort of thing?
Sure. So the way that our CCA program is currently structured is on an opt-out basis. So most users in the city, if you have default NYSEG electricity supply, you would automatically be enrolled in CCA. If, for example, you have you're purchasing directly from an ESCO, an energy supply company, say you're getting renewable energy certificates or something like that, then you would not automatically be enrolled. And at the end of the day, I think it would be up to the individual utility payer whether or not, financially that makes sense for you. But I expect that program would be rolled out, and it all depends on who pays the utilities and whose name is on that bill. If it's Cornell University and it's going to facilities, then the entire university would need to opt in, which is conversations that we're entertaining as well. But if it's just, a couple of buildings here and there, then more than likely you would be automatically enrolled. Communications on that will probably start this fall. And the full program, if market conditions are right and we can secure a competitive rate, then that will launch in late spring, early summer 2024.
Thank you. Rocco is the president of the undergraduate IFC, and I'll give the floor to him.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today and your time and presenting. I really appreciate it. After going through this presentation and sort of listening to all the problems that the Green New Deal is going to pose, and this is just me realistically, I think that number one, this really doesn't help the City of Ithaca's relation with the IFC fraternities. There were already multiple times this semester where the City of Ithaca had yanked certificate of occupancy permits for not really that credible of reasons, and it really upset a lot of member chapters. But I think further to that point, the financing of this and the speed at which it needs to be done really doesn't, I guess, respect the historic nature of these buildings and the complexity associated with them. I just looking at the number, right? it doesn't really seem feasible to me. I mean, it's like $11 million. And I just don't know where these orgs are going to come up with that money to accomplish this. And so I guess my question is like, how do we get to the point where this is possible and organizations won't be screwed over when their boiler goes down in like 27 and like they're forced to like undergo these massive renovations or go without heating? And like a follow-up to that is like, how do we alter this Green New Deal to like better accommodate these special circumstances of like fraternity organizations?
I can start with that. So the Green New Deal does not include any ordinances other than, or any mandates as it stands, other than the Energy Code supplement, which is now just as aggressive as the state energy code. As far as, you know, the historic nature of properties and electrification, there are actually incentives that are only available to historic properties that are specifically available to preserve the historic nature of those properties in pursuit of electrification. As far as, you know, occupancy permits and that sort of thing, that's not my wheelhouse. That's code enforcement, so I can't really speak to that. And you had one last question on the end there that I am struggling to
I can maybe
remember.
take
Funding.
some of that, Rebecca.
Yeah, go for it.
You know, the question, first of all, about, you know, the historic nature of these buildings, landmark status, that sort of thing, is one that we're very familiar with in BlocPower. You know, we started in Brooklyn, lots of very old vintage buildings in New York City. They're protected by really extensive landmark codes from the Department of Buildings. We're very used to working around the regulations such that we can do these projects in a way that respects landmark status and is not a total gut overhaul. You know, we can make these systems fit into just about any type of building. In terms of the financing, you know, 11 million is a very high level estimate for all the buildings, looking at a broad range of electrification measures. That's not what it would necessarily come down to. We would have to do more analysis on each building because each one is different. That's also pre-incentive money, which would be pretty significant for buildings like this, depending on the measures chosen. And then most importantly, that's one of the gaps that BlocPower can help fill in our financing, because nobody has $11 million laying around for something like this. That's why our, you know, zero money down financing helps fill some of that gap.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to follow up, and sorry for going out of order, but I mean these buildings, I don't know if I know one of you guys was like a Lambda alum, but like I mean they're all different and every single one is like massive and they all have these weird little aspects about them and these weird side rooms and high ceilings and old, like I know you guys talked about like the cracks in the windows or whatever, but like I mean literally, like if you're saying to me that like 11 million is a high level estimate, like I can nearly guarantee that that money is going to be higher because of all the special circumstances that these buildings have. On top of that, the construction material used to make these buildings, like I would imagine that like there might be some asbestos in there. And so, you know, from the perspective of like, oh, like we're going to go in and do these repairs, it's like, well, number one, it wouldn't be feasible, I guess, like financially as it stands right now. It's going to cost a lot more money, although there are these incentives. But number two, you have to remember the time frame that you're going to be working to accomplish all of these, right? I mean, you literally only have like 2.5 months during the summer to get it done. Otherwise, the buildings are occupied the entire year. And so it's not something that at least a lot of the member chapters would be happy with for like, let's say BlocPower to come in and like work on the stuff when like they're worrying about classes, like they want to have social events at their facilities. It's just honestly like not really a realistic thing. And me personally, like I don't think it accomplishes a whole lot. Like this whole like climate change, decarbonization stuff for fraternity houses.
So
Why don't
the
we?
vast
Why don't
majority
we?
of,
Well, go ahead and quick response. I want to go on to the other people. We have a lot of people in line.
the vast majority of projects that we do are in occupied buildings. This doesn't require anyone vacating for months at a time. You know, typically we can get these done in a couple weeks. It is a little bit disruptive, but it's not going to turn your world upside down. You know, you know, if you're interested, I'd love to speak to you in more detail in another call about the particularities of your home, of your house.
All right. Why don't we hear from Peter Warner, who's the facility coordinator for all of Greek Life houses, at least the Cornell-owned ones. Peter Warner, you have the floor.
Thank you. Real quick,
just to address Rocco's concerns, I would also point out that 11 million, when you break that down, that's about 350,000 per house. So we're not looking at each house looking for 11 million. But those numbers will vary for sure. I guess my question is more on the technical side. Having lived both in Brooklyn and in Ithaca, and being a Rochesterian, I know that there's pretty vast differences across the state in the typical climate. There's been amazing, advances in air source heat pumps, but we'd still be looking at least a handful of days each year where we drop below negative 13 degrees, and we would need some kind of backup heating system. Frequently, that in the past has been a large scale resistance heat backup. I'm wondering what some of the new regulations, how you would parse what they say about resistance heat, because it feels to me like they're saying no more than 10% of the floor plate can have resistance heat, but what if it's just your literal backup for the coldest days where your heat pumps shut down? So that's my first question, and then I'm going to go on to a related one.
Ethan, do you want to take
Yeah,
that?
Ethan, you're the engineer, so I'll
Yeah,
defer to you.
I couldn't tell if the question was more regulation based, what's required for in terms of backup, but in general, certainly, heat pumps don't shut down at those low temperatures. They're less efficient, so they won't be able to put out the whole heating, the entire heating load that they're rated for. So, with some backup resistance heating, temperature should be acceptable for those very few number of hours in a heating season where those temperatures are that low. But a lot of the new laws and regulations coming out do make exceptions for systems that are purely backup. So there is some recognition that not all backup systems can be electric as well. So I think between the technology being so much better with the hyperheat cold performance pumps, and then just laws having some kind of common sense in them with backups, which they already do, I think folks are pretty well covered.
If
Great.
I can interject before you ask your second question, is there any provision for keeping natural gas fueled backup heating? In other words, a primary heat pump, but then on those coldest days going back to the natural gas furnaces? Or is that forbidden?
Quite candidly, this is something that the city is considering for one of our first buildings to be electrified, at least for 1 to 2 years, having that natural gas furnace backup. But after that 2-year trial period, we anticipate decommissioning that equipment.
And you anticipate requiring decommissioning, or just for the city buildings?
No, that's just the approach that we're taking, that we would want to ultimately decommission those. But right now, nothing is required except for new buildings. So any electrification of property is entirely voluntary.
Any electrification of older buildings is entirely voluntary.
As it stands right now, that is correct. However, the
and
state
that's true.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, but under the state plan, it's a 2026 cutoff and 2028 right now.
Are you talking about the
electrification?
Well, yeah, not for existing buildings. And that's for commercial buildings. I'm not sure how your buildings are ultimately zoned, if they're zoned as commercial multifamily or not. But in the city, and again, we're not talking about the town or Cayuga Heights or Lansing or anything like that. there's nothing that's required other than for new buildings, but I anticipate the state is going to come out with mandates within the next 5 years. So it's in the best financial interest to get ahead of that game, especially as it relates to supply chains. But yeah, as it stands right now, nothing is mandated.
Okay. Peter Warner had a second follow-up question. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah. So the natural route to take, if you're really worried about those low temperature issues, would be ground source heat pumps rather than air source. BlocPower folks, you talked about how you have done those systems, but Rebecca, you mentioned that you had taken a look at doing that for the city buildings, and I'm really thinking about, let's say, City Hall downtown, where you don't have much, parking lot or anything like that to do that. What did your analysis show for facilities that have very little space outside of the footprint as far as feasibility?
All right, is that a question for
Rebecca?
BlocPower or for Rebecca?
It's for Rebecca. Rebecca, you had said that you had done an analysis of
Well, why don't
ground
we ask
source heat
Rebecca? I will make
pumps.
sure she's unmuted.
Sorry about that. I missed your question. Can you repeat it?
Yeah, you had said that you were doing an analysis of ground source heat pumps for city buildings. And I'm curious, for something like City Hall, where you don't have much footprint outside of the actual footprint of the building, what did your analysis show? Because I think that, well, not all of the frats are in this position. There are plenty of them that will not have, a large yard, let's say, to do that kind of ground source heat pump.
Yeah, and the reality is that ground source, I mean, even just financially doesn't make sense for most buildings in the city, and for, whether it's just sheer disruption to normal activity or it's the usually significantly higher cost for geothermal, it really just doesn't pencil out, and that's more or less the case for the city as well. When it may start making more sense is if we can start doing more sort of district loops, and if we can start taking advantage of heat that already exists, say from sewer lines, what have you, so that even if water has to travel a really long ways, we're still maintaining some of that heat throughout that loop. So we're interested in doing a pilot on that, or at least doing some preliminary analysis to see if that's possible. I don't know how familiar you are with the DeWitt Mall. The city doesn't own any property there, but we do lease that park itself. It's surrounded by county buildings as well as churches. So is there potential there? There's also a pilot going on in the Southside neighborhood right now to look at district loops. But again, the real challenge then becomes, you need everybody to agree at the same time that this is the direction that they want to head, and that's sort of the major headache here. But technically speaking, it should be possible depending on where the building is in the geography or geology below it. But that I'm not entirely familiar with exactly where your buildings are located, but that could be worth exploring, certainly.
My plan is to push Cornell at least to do small districts
Nice.
for a lot of our buildings. So
That's cool.
I guess the natural question then for BlocPower is how does small district heating work with your programs?
Certainly the first step is with feasibility study. So it'd have to come together, find out where are those financial barriers, but BlocPower is certainly able to finance that work. A lot of the times there's funding that we can come up with together for those initial feasibility studies, and then as the scope gets hammered out, that really opens some of the floodgates to the programs out there. We've been very successful right here in Ithaca with this nice egg incentive for heat pumps in gas constrained areas, which Ithaca is, and they bridge the gap between the cost of a heat pump system and a traditional fossil fuel system. So, for instance, the Science Center is in final design for a ground source heat pump system that could potentially hook into a larger district system. And so we've been able to help them get additional funding for that project through this gas kicker program that's really underutilized. We're hearing from the utility. So there are ways to build a feasible project, and we're excited to partner in those.
Yeah, and Peter, I'll just
Okay.
mention quickly, at least from the city perspective and the county's perspective, our biggest challenge to these district systems has been exactly what Ethan mentioned, was the getting funding for the feasibility analysis. There isn't a lot of funding available at the state or at the federal level for the very first step that's required, because everyone's trying to get those sort of easy wins that they can, report back to their various directors and heads of state or whatever. And so that to me is where I think Cornell is in a really, really good position, because you have so many faculty, especially in the engineering department, that are trying to give students in particular those sort of hands-on skills that they could potentially do that for free. I mean, you're talking about a semester or a year-long project potentially. But I think, projects for you all where you could potentially partner with the academic side of things could potentially save you a lot of money.
Peter, do you have any follow-up? Otherwise, we can go on to Steve. Okay, Steve, your mic is open.
Thank you, Robert. Let me start with Rebecca, and I hope that the somewhat specific questions I'll ask and get answers to will help other people, and they're being universal. First of all, Rebecca, we're a privately owned fraternity house that is basically across the street from West Campus, where West Ave and University Ave meet. So we're very close to campus, as close as you can get. I supervised a renovation we did of our kitchen just 5 years ago. And you were talking about moving from gas on kitchen equipment to electrical. I was told, and I know for a fact because of the work we did, that three-phase electrical was not available to us at our location, and that's right across the street from campus. Peter can tell you if all of West Campus is three-phase. I don't necessarily know, or if the old SIU building and Sigma Phi are three-phase, but I know we could not get it unless we were willing to pay to bring it from Stewart Ave up to West Ave. Now, that's going to be a big restriction on what we can do on many fronts. So my first question is that going to be solved by the state or the city, or am I supposed to offset that cost myself?
You're talking about upgrading electrical service? Is that that what we're trying to solve?
That's the first thing I'd like to ask about, because as I said, I had an upgrade done to our electrical, and we went to what was the maximum we were allowed to have as a building. We're a residential, we're not commercial, but we sleep up to 40 people or so. Mm-hmm. But I can't, as far as I know, I cannot get more electrical than I have now. And the second question I was moving to, which I'll just reference here, was we already have begun investigation into installing charging stations for EV cars, because we anticipate brothers having EV cars, and we want to supply them. We don't want to be behind other houses or Cornell in terms of what we're supplying to brothers, because you could see in the future somebody not wanting, and we don't think it's legit, but somebody could say, geez, this house has charging stations, this house doesn't. I like both of them, but the amenities there are better, so I'll join there. We don't want to fall behind on that. But again, given the limitations of what we were told 5 years ago, and the expense of bringing three-phase to our building, who's gonna, is that something the city's gonna take care of, or?
So the short answer is no, that there are some pretty strict restrictions on how the city can actually spend money, and at the benefit of any resident is one of the ways that we cannot spend money legally. However, we are working directly with the utility, both NYSEG and their parent company Avangrid and RG&E, to try and figure out how are we actually going to tackle a lot of these issues. So can we deploy battery storage? Can we deploy renewables? Are there other ways that we can meet the needs so that we may not actually have to invest in those service upgrades? And these are, iterative conversations that have been going on for the past 2 years. And I mean, the short answer right now is that there is no silver bullet. But I actually just had a meeting today with Avangrid and NYSERDA and Siemens and some of our local engineers that are looking at exactly what you're talking about, and how do we find solutions to this that, don't leave the burden on individual property owners, because that's not in the best interest of anybody. We're not doing this to piss people off at the end of the day. And, I do see this mention of gas stoves and, ease of cooking and that sort of thing. And actually the people that tell you that gas is the best way to cook is the gas companies, people that are selling you gas. That induction.
Yeah, please,
actually
I'm not opposed to
Okay.
moving away from gas, but well, let's move on to Russ and Ethan. If we only have single phase electrical in our facility, and it sleeps 40 some odd people, what's the practicality of bringing in all these options? Do we
Well,
need
could I
three-phase or
interject
not?
there, Steve? Steve, could I interject? Okay, the first thing is, for the people in the audience that aren't as savvy as Steve, most electricity is so-called single phase, but by installing a different transformer on the pole outside of your house, you can get three-phase, which is a way of sort of tricking the same wires as bringing in more power, more densely on the same power lines. And you have three-phase motors and so on that will take that power. So that's what three-phase refers to. It is my opinion that who pays for those upgrades of service from the street to the meter is dictated by the NYSEG tariff. And there are rules, and in many cases it is the responsibility of the utility and not the owner to pay for the upgrade of service. So if you really are talking about putting new transformers all along Stewart Avenue, or adding more electric wires to the telephone poles along Stewart Avenue, that's something that's part of the service obligation of NYSEG or any other utility. And there are ways of getting a hold of the NYSEG tariff from their website, reading it, and figuring out what arguments you want to make. And there is some negotiation involved in that. So it's not a black box, and it's not something from which only the city can prevail upon. But Steve, did you have other questions other than the three-phase power question?
Yeah, thank you, Robert, for explaining that and for giving us that detail. As I said, I'll move on, but I just say that when we upgraded, we were told by the electrical that we would have to pay for 6 to 8 poles being installed in order to get the power, the three-phase from Stewart Ave up to University and West. So let me move on to Ethan. I'd love to set up a call or whatever with Russ or Ethan on this, but as I said, we are very interested in installing some EV power stations in our parking lot. We have 2 separate parking lots. So without having to occupy everybody's time, I'd love to be able to set up a call with you guys to go into the discounts that are available or the offsets that are available, and maybe get a site visit from somebody to see how we could make this happen. Is there anything you want to say generally about EV installation, EV charging station installations?
Oh, we'd love to talk further. As I was saying, NYSEG has excellent incentives for the Ithaca area. Their websites show that the city is in a geography that they define as the maximum incentives for these chargers. So yeah, we would love to follow up with you and see how we can get that process going.
Can I email you then tomorrow
Sure.
or in the near future? Great, I will. And I'd appreciate it. I know your email is right there with your name. If you could, somebody could put, is it Russ basically at blockpower.io?
Exactly. Yeah, and I put a link in the chat to
I
the
just saw
intake
it. I'm going
form
to
for
take it
Ithaca.
down. Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'll copy that.
great.
Yeah, so that intake form, you can enter some basic information about your building, and that'll help us generate some very initial estimates that are better than block maps, and then with a site visit with further follow up, it gets refined and refined.
Great. Well, maybe we can set up a site visit because I'll be up for reunion, and maybe during that 3-day period, you guys can come over and take a look at our house, and then give us some of it. I don't know if it's either one of you two, but whoever represents and can come over and take a look at our house, and we can discuss different things. Thank you
Mhm.
very much, Robert. I appreciate the
Sure.
time.
Okay, Alexander, did you have your hand up before, or do you have any questions pending? Yeah, go ahead, Alexander from Delta Phi.
Thanks. I did, but I think generally they've been answered. I think this is very helpful. We're actually very much looking into this particular issue because we're dealing with Lenrock, which is Ezra Cornell's mansion, which is our chapter house. It's about 150 years old, and it's the heating system. Is constantly needing work and repair, and it's a big burden on us. And we're looking forward to perhaps moving on to newer technologies like heat pumps. So this is great to hear that there's a move in this direction. And I'm not sure, a colleague of mine on the Alumni Association has been looking into this quite a bit, and I'm not sure if he's reached out, but I'm gonna reach out, in the next few days and confer with him just to see if there's a way that BlocPower could help us in in electrifying and moving off of gas.
Sure.
So, and for that purpose, I'd like to make sure that my colleague does have access to what I think was a very good presentation here. Is this going to be recorded and distributed to those?
It is being recorded, and I will post it and send out the link. My profound hope from scheduling this just a few weeks before reunion is that when we all go back to our annual meetings of our alumni associations, were typically held during reunion weekend, that we really educate and activate more alumni interest, because someone has to foot the bills, and if it isn't the federal government, chances are it's alumni. So this is something that should be the topic one of a lot of alumni conversations over reunion weekend. Yeah, I feel very strongly, and I hope that this video will be shared. I did
Yeah,
want
and
to
Alex,
go ahead.
Yeah, I was
yeah,
going to say,
real
if I
quick,
could just
Alex,
follow. Yeah, go ahead, Ethan. Yeah, I'm sorry.
yeah, I just want to mention that this really is an opportune time to start thinking and focusing on this, because as I mentioned in the presentation, there are two major subsidies right now that will either be phasing out or changing in 3 to 6 months. And you can get locked into those now that can cover the vast majority of insulation costs, which can be big for old buildings, and can cover a big chunk up to $200,000 of heat pump electrification. So, having that double whammy could be very promising.
Yeah. And further on that, my understanding, Ethan, if I grasp the gist of your presentation, was that you're essentially willing to finance or able to finance this for the owners of the properties over a relatively long term, which I would imagine, if there is cost savings to be had in terms of energy efficiency, ideally and theoretically, this should net out so that it maybe isn't costing them anything out of pocket, to address the concerns, I think, of Rocco, our IFC president, who is very concerned about cost. I mean, we are too, of course. What's going to be out of pocket? But is there a way to work this between subsidies, tax credits that you mentioned that you guys can take advantage of, and otherwise? So ultimately, let's say you put in a system that has, I don't know if it's a 20-year lifespan, with the predicted energy savings. Is there a case where you might end up with little or no out-of-pocket costs?
We certainly can't guarantee that in advance, especially for these older buildings, but certainly combined with significant weatherization plus the electrification, you're definitely headed in the right direction, So it would take more detailed analysis to see where that lands. But certainly when you're improving the efficiency significantly, then you're much more likely to land in that camp.
I want to amplify on what Ethan said, which is, if you can tell me the exact curve of future energy prices, I can tell you the answer to your question. What you're really doing is coming up with a strategy to hedge against future energy price increases. It's a question of present day investment versus future energy costs. And I'm going to give the floor to Peter Warner.
Thanks. Yeah, to Steve's point about the electricity, and I think more generally, I have 4 buildings right down McGraw, right? Like they're gonna have needs as well. I think on a lot of these things, we should be looking at our neighbors, right? And saying who else in IFC is right nearby that's going to need these things. If we need to all work together to get the 3-phase power there, then let's, that's going to reduce the cost for each building. Deke and Lambda Chi are right near each other. That's one of the first areas I'm thinking about for a district heating. I'm not just thinking about the on-campus buildings. I would like, if we can possibly do something like that, I would like it to hit the off-campus buildings that are right in the neighborhood. I think everybody needs to really be thinking that way as we go through this. Like who else is around that can maybe pitch in? Unfortunately, Lenrock doesn't have a lot there, but like the lodge is right nearby, right? Like maybe there's something, I know they're not IFC, but they're going to be hit with these same regulations and they're in a similar boat. Like maybe talking to them about how can we do something together. In any case, that just generally, I think that we need to be thinking that way about this, because I think together we can do it better.
Okay, I think that Steve P had his hand up.
Yeah, thank you again, Robert. First of all, let me say to Peter, I just posted my email address, Peter, and if you want to, I'd love to discuss that with you or with Kara and you or however it, we're Sigma Pi, so we're right across the street, 730 University. We'd be very interested in something like that or any kind of cooperative deal we could work into. My other question was originally to Rebecca. As I said, Rebecca, we are now a residential. Have you heard any conversations within Ithaca City government of changing that designation for privately owned fraternity houses to commercial? Good.
No, I'm just not familiar with how those are zoned. So typically if it's, housing more than X number of people or families and it ultimately is zoned commercial, I'm not familiar. That's not my area of expertise.
All right, and Robert, in the chat I have my email so that you could send me the link because I'd love to get additional people that are on our facilities committee of our alumni association, as Alexander said, to watch this video and come back with questions. And then, as I said, we'll set something up with Ethan or Russ or whoever they think is appropriate for us to talk to.
Sure. And now I'll turn it over to Alexander, who has his hand up and another question.
All right, thanks. Appreciate it. So another thing occurred to me in terms of weatherization and insulation. One of the biggest problems we have is single pane, very drafty windows. I mean, they leak like a sieve. And the hurdle we're up against is when it comes to modernizing those, we're a historic property, and I think there are a lot of those in Ithaca. There are a lot of limitations on what you can do with windows. So we have this quandary. We'd love to be more energy efficient, yet we are working against this very restrictive ability to change what is probably the most energy inefficient aspect of most of our houses. Especially, it's very difficult to get, original 150-year-old windows that, just don't have the benefit of modern technology and modern materials to seal properly. So, do you have any suggestions on how to address this issue? And might there be some movement in the historic buildings space that might allow us to change our perspective on how we treat buildings from dealing with windows, that maybe we need to loosen things up a little bit when it comes to maintaining old single pane wooden windows? Does it really make sense to do that in
Okay,
today's day?
I'll let Peter Warner answer that.
I'm hoping by reunion, if you swing by Balshall, you'll be able to see the brand new windows that are super energy efficient that we're putting in this week as part of the major renovation, which are historically accurate to the time period. So there are lots of things out there. There's companies in Western New York that specialize in windows. Nick, I don't know if you recall offhand the name of that company we met from Rochester. It's slipping my mind right now. Anyway, but there's companies that specialize in windows. It might have been Rochester Colonial, in fact.
Which building is getting those new windows, Peter?
Balch Hall.
Waltz Hall?
Balch.
Balch.
Yeah. BALCH. So that their windows were an old casement window. So what we're putting in are casements that look nearly identical, but are actually low E glass with insulation and a modern system. But they look very, very original. And we saw Nick and I were at a historic preservation conference recently, and we saw one of the windows where they have the entire window swings either in or out, but when it's closed, it's an exact match essentially to the historic window. So there's a lot of options out there.
And just so I understand, these new windows, are they still made of wood, or are they just made appearance-wise so they fit within the look and feel of the historic building?
So there's different ways to go with that. I know that a lot of fiberglass stuff has a wood look, but there are some all wood ones. And again, Rochester Colonial had a lot of stuff that they were showing that was wood. That was also, a more modern window, but it was wood. And there's definitely room for ILPC to negotiate with you. So they know that Rebecca needs her needs met as well. It's not just that. And that's true throughout the state for historic preservation and historic districts, that everyone knows that electrification and energy efficiency are things that we need to move towards, even and sometimes especially in our historic buildings.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I'd love to reach out and discuss this further with you. I guess you mentioned you work with Nick. I understand, because we work with Nick as well. So presumably we can get in touch.
Yeah. Nick's got his fingers in everything.
I'd like to just put a plug really quickly for Historic Ithaca here. They're an amazing resource that are really focused on electrification also. But their bread and butter is historic preservation, and They love conversations like this. So if you were to reach out to them, they would love to do a site visit and talk about what your options are, put you in touch with. They also have deep knowledge about all of the additional incentives that are available for historic properties.
Mhm.
Okay. Ethan has his hand up, and after he
Yeah.
makes his comment, if he could also summarize, and I'll give him a chance to make a closing statement, and then I'll
boy.
call on Rebecca for closing statement.
Oh yeah, I just want to. It sounds like there's a lot of innovation going on with Windows. It's a very important subject. One company that BlocPower is starting to work with and really quantify the performance of their systems is called Indo, like window without the W, and they have like window systems that are on the inside of the building that are kind of like an indoor storm window that look very nice and that they seal well and can be much more inexpensively purchased and installed than a new window. And so that's another potential option out there. I spoke to NICEAG's multifamily energy efficiency program about that, and their program administrator had used windows like that and just loved them. And so there's different approaches out there to address this.
So do you want to just summarize for 1 minute or two as your closing remarks, Ethan?
Yeah, so BlocPower's here to serve the Ithaca community. We're focused on building electrification and just this process. Any major energy shift change is big, is scary. A lot of energy shifts in the history of humanity have been slower, and this is unique that the world's trying to implement one faster. So there's going to be problems to solve. There's going to be creativity that's needed. BlocPower is trying to address a lot of those issues. What we can, like you've heard, we offer financing for both more typical financing provided by the state through Green Jobs, Green New York, financing that's specifically raised for underserved communities, and also having the expertise to manage these sorts of projects. I'll let Russ talk just for 30 seconds of my time as well. I think at this point he's going to be a little better spoken than me.
I mean, not too much to add. Like these are big projects we're talking about. These are not like for like replacements at all. And every building is unique. Just hearing a little bit from each of you tonight about the specific concerns you have. Rocco, you mentioned the particularities of each house, and they're old and they're laid out kind of weird. I get that. We understand that. And so, I would love to talk to any of you who are interested in more detail about what might be a good solution for your house that, meets your needs and is affordable and is going to be an investment that you're happy with. So both of our emails are in the chat there. Feel free to reach out. We would love to be a resource for you all and, help electrify.
Okay. Rebecca?
Thanks. I don't know that I have anything substantial to add after that. Just really wanted to underscore, BlocPower is a really, really critical partner in this transition for the City of Ithaca, and is really driving this transition to fully electric buildings. And there's a reason that they are the ones that are driving this. It's because we trust them and because they have a product that we think really, really works, and hopefully it can work for you all as well. And, like Russ, I am a resource here to help navigate new, state incentives, state mandates, federal incentives, trying to keep fingers on the pulse as they become available. And when I don't know what's going on, I certainly do know someone that does. So happy to answer questions, at any point. My email is, I'll put it in the chat as well.
Okay.
But thank you.
Well, I want to thank our three panelists. They were excellent, and I also want to thank Peter Warner and Nick Finelli from the Cornell staff, who are also excellent resources for Greek life. This is a very important problem. It's not going to go away. It's not going to be solved overnight. It's not going to be solved inexpensively. And I would just urge everyone here to sort of talk it up with your colleagues, because this is something that is very important and really could have make or break financial impacts to fraternities long term if it's mismanaged. And again, thanks to all, and we'll adjourn for now, and hopefully we'll have another fraternity roundtable discussion later this summer. Thank you so much for attending.
Let's say
Thank
thank
you,
you
Thanks,
to
everyone.
Bob, for
Robert.
putting this together. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you for organizing.
Thanks all.
Okay.